So the world's eyes are on the Scottish city of Glasgow as the COP26 climate conference gets underway. Delegates from around 200 countries are set to discuss a global response to the climate crisis. Several key leaders, including US President Joe Biden and UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson, will arrive after the end of the G20 summit in Rome. Almost every year since 1995, world leaders get together at a meeting known as the Conference of Parties, or COP. This year is considered to be a make-or-break year to confront the global climate emergency. And here's why this year's talks are so crucial. The Paris Agreement 6 years ago was a historic turning point for climate action. Nearly every nation at that time agreed to keep global warming well below 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels and to try to aim for 1.5. Many have since made emission plans to help achieve that goal. But to meet the 1.5 target, global emissions need to be cut by 45% in 2030. That's compared with 2010 levels. The UN says that won't happen unless pledges are scaled up dramatically. In fact, the current commitments will actually lead to a sizable emissions increase of 16%. So nations will need to submit much bolder plans to cut emissions at COP26 to avoid what's expected to be a climate catastrophe. Developed countries made a pledge back in 2009 to channel $100 billion every year to developing countries by 2020 last year. The funds are to support their climate actions, but as you can see from that graph, although the amount has risen each year, the target has never been reached. An official plan ahead of the summit says the developed nations are confident they can reach the $100 billion goal by 2023, but that is 3 years late. COP26 is the world's moment of truth, according to the UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson. The summit lasts for 2 weeks, with discussions getting properly underway on November the 1st. Well, CGTN's Andrew Wilson is in Glasgow. Andrew, what can we expect then in concrete terms from these leaders at COP26?
Concrete is a word, Polly, they don't use very much in these COP talks. There's an awful lot hanging in the balance at the moment. Alok Sharma, the UK president of COP26, kicked off proceedings today and said that the red lights are flashing red on the climate dashboard. He said this is a time where decisions must be made. Now, because of the arrangement of the Paris Accords that you mentioned just then in 2015, there was a promise to revisit all the calculations, the scientific calculations and the contributions from member countries every 5 years. Well, that should have been last year, but this conference has been delayed by a year because of the pandemic. So this is a time now to revisit Paris, and as you pointed out, the figures they thought that would lead them to a reduction, enough to get them down to 1.5%, are now pointing at a 16% rise by 2030, taking them to 2.7%, which scientists describe as catastrophic. So there's going to have to be a revision of the commitment from the developing nations and also from the developed nations in terms of their emissions, and also a revision of those nations that are in the eye of the storm of climate change, the smaller developing countries, to make sure that they get what they're owed by the COP26 and previous COP plans, which is compensation and support from the wealthier countries. So there's two things to work out in this crucial 2-week meeting. One is to get the big emitters to promise to bring down their emissions and prove a verifiable timetable to do that, and also for the developed and wealthier nations to come up with a more promising formula to compensate those countries that will have to adapt and change to come along with the climate changes agreed here at COP26, should they indeed be agreed.
And Andrew, how likely is it that those leaders can agree and achieve some sort of consensus on this?
The timing's difficult on this, Polly. I mean, 2020 was the original timetable for this. That would have been even worse. That was when nations around the world were at their lowest confidence because of the pandemic. but there are still a lot of headwinds facing world leaders today in terms of making brave decisions that might affect their economies. The pandemic is still biting. There's an energy crisis going on. China has had to start opening and increasing its coal production and coal burning in the last 3 months because of the energy crisis there. And around the world, world leaders are worried about how their nation states and their economies are going to fare in the next couple of years. So all that is making leaders less confident in terms of making pledges, those crucial pledges that Alok Sharma, as the president, will be looking for to try and put some sort of solid timetable together to get things moving forward. But there is good news as well, and that is that if you look back even to Paris 5 years ago, 6 years ago now, only about a quarter of the world's countries had made any kind of pledge whatsoever. That's up to about 80%. Most of the world's leading economies have now made a pledge of one sort or other to bring themselves down to net zero emissions by a certain date. They're all far too far in the future, but it's a start. And analysts say that while the momentum gets going, as long as they don't move the momentum, it'll be up to the negotiators to keep pressing these governments to get more and more generous with their promises and swifter with their timetables.